In some ways, especially in the aftermath of the assassination attempt this past weekend on Donald Trump's life, there was a thought that maybe he wouldn't be going for an attack dog, maybe someone who preaches more a message of unity. And that isn't necessarily what Donald Trump has chosen.
Yeah, JD Vance was, as you say, the odds-on favorite. The smart money was always behind him. He had a lot of important people in his corner, including the president's son, Don Trump Jr. But yeah, he comes from the more ideological wing of the party. Trump had others he could have gone with, including Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, comes from the governor's wing of the party, very policy-focused. JD Vance, I think of as sort of the literary face of the Trump movement, right? He had that 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, that was this gripping personal story that really sort of laid bare a lot of the economic frustrations and the cultural malaise out in the country that a lot of people have used to explain Trump's rise to power. It's a generational shift. He's a lot younger, as you pointed out. But it also, the most disappointed people today have got to be not just Burgum and Rubio and Scott, maybe the other people who are considered, but this could be Trump's heir apparent in 2028. Trump can't run again after 4 more years. He's only 39 years old. You have to think that he is a future Republican candidate, not just for vice president, but for president of the United States.
It's not the first time we've heard that this hour, is it? I spoke with a Republican source shortly after this announcement. Julie Fine described him as the youngest, hungriest, angriest, and most red meat option that Donald Trump had, that we've been talking about at least. So Trump can now sit back and let Vance run and play defense for him. What do you think?
I don't think that the former president is ever one to sit back. I think he will continue being, the pressure isn't on him as much to be the attack person.
He's got another player on the field now, though.
Right, he's got somebody that can do it for him at this point. He has another person here. I think what'll be interesting here is to see how JD Vance handles this, because as you know, there's been all this discussion now about decorum and bringing down the volume after what happened this past weekend. So how does JD Vance handle that? This is not a guy that brings down the volume. So it'll be interesting to see how that fits into the ticket.
Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting to consider not just whether he brings down the volume, but who he brings along with him. If this is another white man, another populist white man at that, what nuance can he provide that would attract, say, an independent, undecided voter or someone who voted for Nikki Haley in the Republican primary?
I think the thing that he brings to a very small degree is youth in terms of who we're seeing running right now. I mean, he's younger. He has a different background. I mean, he's an author. Many people have read this book. This was a very, it was a very popular read. It wasn't just something that you sort of picked up off a shelf at some point. It was a very popular read. I think he's well known with that. But I think if he brings a somewhat younger vote, and I think that's really the biggest difference between him and the former president.
Interesting. He was slated to speak tomorrow night, which might have been an attempt to get reporters off the scent here a little bit. Now that is officially the Wednesday night vice presidential nominee speech, as usual. It looks like that Kristi Noem now officially has a speaking role in this convention. And I wonder more broadly, when we think about the messaging at this RNC, Gregory, if this is the unity, conciliatory, changed Trump that we've been hearing about since Saturday, or if we're kind of getting back to MAGA.
Look, I think we're going to have to see. I mean, the convention just gaveled to order just an hour or two ago. And that is, in my mind, the single biggest question of this convention. There's no suspense that Donald Trump's going to accept the nomination. He's now been nominated. He's going to accept the nomination. We now know who the vice presidential pick is. So the rest of what we're going to be looking for over the next 4 days is exactly that, whether Trump makes good on this promise that he ripped up his speech and now is going to give a more, you can call it conciliatory, but some sort of appeal to national unity, how that changes the whole tone and texture of this convention, whether that changes how people perceive Donald Trump. After Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, he talked about how that was a defining moment in his life, and he thought that God sort of put him, saved him from that assassination attempt for a reason, and it gave him a new purpose. I want to see on Thursday night whether Donald Trump gives us some sense of that new purpose that he has been imbued with after that very narrow escape from assassination on Saturday night.
Yeah, well, we know, at least from an interview he gave the Washington Examiner, that he was originally planning on how he described it to be a humdinger of a speech. He's reworking it now, says he wants to focus more on unity. But it's one thing to look at how Donald Trump may shift his tone. It's another to think about Joe Biden's tone, knowing that in just a few hours we're all going to get to watch an interview, a sit-down with NBC's Lester Holt, that he's been speaking about Donald Trump as a threat to democracy, when Trump just this past weekend was threatened himself during the course of the democratic process. How complicated does the messaging now become for Joe Biden, or is the new outlet for Joe Biden's attack JD Vance?
Yeah, I think it really has narrowed the path forward for Biden strategically in terms of how he can talk about Trump and how hard he can go after him. I think you raised a good point. I think bringing in Vance is a good strategy, and the Biden campaign has also tried to make this not just about Trump the person, who obviously they have attacked him on his character. They've attacked him on January 6th, but they've also tried to attack him on policy, on abortion, on his handling of COVID, on his these more sort of democratic issues. And so those, I think, will remain. The policy issues certainly have not gone away just because of what happened on Saturday night. Mm-hmm. But yes, Biden has to be a lot more careful about how he talks about this, on top of all of the questions about his age and how he talks about really anything, anytime, anywhere, given his debate performance last month.
We understand, just very quickly, Julie, we're going to be hearing snippets from Joe Biden's sit-down interview on NBC News. Is this a forest, a tree falling in the woods here? I mean, is anyone going to pay attention to this on day one of the RNC?
I think there's not going to be a ton of attention paid to it. I mean, I think there will be certainly political insiders and those who want to see what he does in terms of, the political cycle moves so quickly. Remember last week we were talking about is Joe Biden even going to make it? Yep. Then this happens over the weekend. That's where all the attention goes. There are still a lot of Democrats that have lined up behind him that don't want him to be the nominee. So I think those will be the people paying specifically close attention. And I will tell you this, we may not be paying attention, but if there's a big gaffe tonight, then people will be paying more attention.